Ivy Forrester had always known how to enter a room as if she already belonged to it. That was her advantage long before she ever stepped back into Forrester Creations. She did not walk. She arrived, carrying with her the kind of presence that did not ask for permission, only acknowledgement. On the morning she chose to confront Will Spencer, the building itself seemed to react to her return, as if memory had been stirred awake in its polished corridors. The executive floor was already tense. Will had spent the entire morning preparing something he believed would finally bring closure to a situation that had been festering beneath the surface for weeks. A formal letter, carefully worded, legally reviewed, emotionally restrained in the way only someone trying to protect themselves from guilt could manage. It was not anger that guided him now, but exhaustion, an attempt to restore order where emotional chaos had begun to bleed into professional life. Ivy's presence had complicated everything. What had once been a tangled personal history had evolved into something more dangerous: ambiguity, the kind that made every decision feel like a moral test rather than a simple choice. Will stood in his office, the letter sealed in an envelope on his desk. He stared at it for a long time before picking it up again, as though repetition might make certainty more permanent. The door opened before he could act. Ivy stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. She looked composed, almost serene. But there was something beneath that stillness, an intentional control, like someone holding a fragile structure together with invisible pressure. "You were about to send it," she said calmly. Will did not deny it. "I don't think there's anything left to discuss," he replied, voice steady but strained. Ivy tilted her head slightly, as if considering the distance between his words and reality. "Isn't there?" she asked. The silence that followed was not empty. It was dense, weighted with everything neither of them had fully admitted during their last encounter: history, regret, unresolved attachment, and the kind of emotional entanglement that did not dissolve just because people wanted it to. We'll place the envelope down. "I'm trying to do this respectfully, Ivy. For both of us." A faint, almost unreadable smile crossed her face. "Respectfully," she repeated softly, as if testing the word. And then, without warning, everything shifted. She reached into her bag. What she pulled out was not a letter, not an argument, not a plea. It was an ultrasound image. The room changed instantly. The air itself seemed to contract around Will's awareness as his eyes locked onto the black and white image. Even before Ivy spoke, something in him already understood that this was not just information, it was disruption. "I was going to wait," Ivy said, her voice softening just enough to sound vulnerable. "But you were going to make a decision that would affect more than just the two of us." Wood did not respond immediately. His gaze remained fixed on the paper in her hand. "What is this?" he asked, though he already knew the shape of the answer. "I'm pregnant," Ivy said. The words landed with surgical precision. No dramatics, no raised voice, just declaration. And yet the impact was immediate. Will took a step back instinctively, as though distance might help him process what proximity had just destroyed. "That's not possible," he said, more to himself than to her. Ivy placed the ultrasound on his desk. "It is," she replied simply. "And it happened the last time we were together." The memory surfaced uninvited. A night blurred by emotional confusion, by unresolved history, by choices made without full clarity. It was not something Will had ever framed in his mind as consequential. At least, not in this way. But Ivy was watching him carefully now, waiting, measuring. What she did not show, what she never allowed to surface, was the calculation beneath the timing. The quiet orchestration of details already arranged long before this conversation ever occurred. The private exchange with a clinic employee, the subtle manipulation of medical documentation, the deliberate shaping of certainty from something far more ambiguous. In her mind, truth was not something discovered. It was something constructed. Will picked up the ultrasound again, his hand unsteady for the first time since she had entered the room. "You can't just," he began, then stopped, as if the sentence itself collapsed under its own weight. "I'm not asking for anything unreasonable," Ivy said gently. "I'm telling you the truth. But truth in that moment was not a stable concept. It was a weapon, a shield, a trap disguised as vulnerability. Across the building, Electra Forrester had been walking toward Will's office when she saw them through the glass partition. She stopped. The sight was not dramatic in itself. Two people standing in a room, a piece of paper between them. But something about Ivy's posture, the angle of Will's attention, the stillness in the air between them, made Electra feel immediately that something irreversible had just begun. She pushed the door open without knocking. "What's going on?" she asked. Her voice cut through the room with sharp clarity. Will looked up, almost as if startled into awareness of her presence. Ivy, however, did not move. Will hesitated. That hesitation was all Electra needed to feel the first fracture of understanding. Ivy turned slightly, holding the ultrasound image in full view. "I thought you should know," she said. Electra's eyes followed the paper, and then everything inside her changed. Not slowly, not gradually, instantly. "No," Electra said under her breath, stepping forward. "No, that's not." Her gaze shifted to Will. He looked like a man caught between realities, unable to fully occupy either one. "You're not actually considering this," Electra said, her voice rising slightly now. Will didn't answer immediately. That silence was worse than denial. "I need time," he said finally. Electra laughed once, sharply, disbelieving. "Time," she repeated. "She drops a pregnancy bomb on you, and you want time?" Ivy's expression remained controlled, but something flickered behind her eyes at Electra's reaction. Not fear, not guilt, but something closer to satisfaction. Because the reaction was proof. Proof that the leverage had worked. We'll set the ultrasound down carefully, as if any sudden movement might shatter what was already fragile. "If this is real," he said slowly, "then it changes things." Electra's stare hardened. "That's exactly what she wants you to believe," she said. Ivy finally looked directly at her. "And what exactly do you think I want?" she asked softly. Electra did not hesitate. "Control," she replied. The word hung between them like a spark suspended in oxygen. For a brief moment, no one spoke. Then Ivy exhaled slowly, almost as if amused. "You always were quick to assume the worst of me," she said. Electra stepped closer, her voice lowering into something more dangerous. "I don't have to assume anything. I can see it." Will raised a hand slightly, as if try to slow the escalation. "Electra," but she didn't stop. "No," she said, still staring at Ivy. "You don't get to walk in here and rewrite everything just because it benefits you." Ivy placed a hand lightly over her stomach. The gesture was subtle, strategic, and devastatingly effective. "I'm not rewriting anything," she said softly. "I'm living it." The implication was clear, and it worked. Will's expression shifted again, conflict deepening, restraint weakening. Responsibility, guilt, uncertainty, all colliding in real time. Electra saw it, and something inside her snapped, not loudly, quietly, like glass under pressure. Later, in the hallway outside the office, Electra stood alone while RJ found her minutes later. Her hands were clenched tightly at her sides, her breathing uneven. "She's lying," Electra said immediately when she saw him. RJ did not ask how she knew. He simply listened. "I can feel it," she continued. "It's not real. It can't be real." RJ studied her face carefully. "But Will doesn't know that," he said. "That was the problem." Electra turned away, pacing slightly. "He's already hesitating," she said. That's all she needed. That hesitation is enough. RJ's expression tightened slightly. "And if it is real?" he asked carefully. Electra stopped. The question hung in the air like a blade that refused to fall quickly enough. "I don't believe it is," she said again, more firmly. But even if it were the timing, the way she did it, she shook her head. "It's manipulation." RJ did not argue, but he did not fully agree either, because in their world, truth was rarely clean. It was layered, distorted, sometimes impossible to separate from strategy. Electra turned back toward the office door. "She's trying to stay," she said quietly, using a child that might not even exist as an anchor. RJ looked at her. "And Will?" he asked. That question hurt more. Electra did not answer immediately, because Will was the center of the trap, not the victim, not the villain, the pivot point. Inside the office, Ivy's plan continued to unfold not through force, but through restraint. She did not demand immediate decisions. She did not raise her voice. Instead, she allowed silence to do the work for her, watching as Will's internal conflict deepened with every passing second. He was already imagining consequences. A child, responsibility, public perception, family legacy, and Electra, standing at the edge of all of it, watching him drift away from certainty. That was the true fracture, not the pregnancy claim, but the psychological shift it created. A world in which leaving Ivy was no longer a clean decision. It was an act that carried weight beyond himself. And Ivy knew it. She had not just introduced a possibility. She had introduced a system of emotional obligation that would require him to stay entangled, at least long enough for doubt to grow roots. Electra, outside, finally understood the shape of the battlefield. This was no longer about love. It was about control through consequence. And she refused to let it stand unchallenged. "I'm going to expose her," she said suddenly. RJ looked at her. "You're sure?" Electra nodded. "I won't let her build a life on a lie," she said. "Not like this." But even as she said it, something deeper inside her stirred. Not doubt about Ivy, but fear about Will. Because in the end, the most dangerous part of Ivy's plan was not deception. It was hesitation, and Will Spencer was already caught inside it. The days that followed Ivy's revelation did not bring resolution. Instead, they stretched into something far more dangerous. Uncertainty that refused to collapse into truth. At Forrester Creations, everything continued outwardly as if nothing had changed. Meetings were held, designs were reviewed, orders were processed. But beneath the polished surface of professional routine, an invisible tension had taken root, spreading through conversations like a virus no one dared name directly. Well, Spencer had not made a final decision. That alone was enough to shift the balance of power. And Ivy Forrester understood that hesitation was her greatest advantage. Electra, however, no longer believed in waiting. She stood in the design studio that afternoon, staring at a sketch she had drawn hours earlier, but could no longer recognize as her own work. The lines were precise, elegant, controlled, but her mind was elsewhere. Every thought circled back to the same point. Ivy's ultrasound, Will's silence, and the unbearable space between truth and manipulation. RJ entered quietly, as he always did when he sensed she was close to breaking into action without fully stabilizing herself. "She's still there," he said simply. Electra didn't need clarification. Ivy had not left. She had not been pushed out. She had not been forced into retreat. She was staying. And every hour she remained inside the building, the narrative she had created gained more weight. Electra turned away from a desk. "I can't let this continue," she said. RJ studied her carefully. "What are you going to do?" he asked. Electra's answer came immediately, as if she had already been thinking about it long before she admitted it aloud. "Find proof." Meanwhile, inside Will's office, the atmosphere had changed in a way that was almost imperceptible to anyone outside the room. Ivy was there again. Not aggressively. Not intrusively. She had not been invited, but she had also not been removed. That ambiguity alone was enough to redefine boundaries. Will stood near the window, looking out at Los Angeles, though his attention was not on the city. It was on the decision he could not yet make. "You don't have to decide everything today," Ivy said softly behind him. Her voice was careful now, measured. Not the forceful declaration of the previous day, but something more dangerous, patience. Will turned slightly. "This affects more than just me," he said. Ivy nodded. "Yes," she agreed. "It does." That agreement was not comforting. It was strategic, because it acknowledged responsibility while reinforcing inevitability. Will exhaled slowly. "I need confirmation," he said finally. For the first time, something subtle shifted in Ivy's expression. Not panic, not surprise. A recalibration. "What kind of confirmation?" she asked. We'll turn fully now. Medical verification. Independent testing. The words were simple, logical, reasonable, and yet they cracked something in the air between them. Ivy held his gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Then she nodded. Of course, she said quietly. But inside her mind, the structure of control adjusted immediately. Because confirmation was a risk, and risk meant exposure. Electra did not wait for permission. By evening, she had already begun her own investigation. RJ had warned her that rushing would only deepen conflict without guaranteeing truth, but Electra was no longer operating from patience. She was operating from necessity. She found the clinic Ivy had allegedly used within hours, not through official channels, but through patterns, timing, and a trail of administrative inconsistencies that did not fully align. What she discovered was not direct proof. It was something more fragile. Discrepancy. A gap in documentation dates that did not match standard processing timelines. A signature that appeared slightly misaligned with known staff handwriting samples. And most importantly, a procedural note that suggested a correction had been made after initial entry. Electra stared at the screen, her pulse tightening. This was not definitive, but it was enough to raise a question that could not easily be dismissed. And that was all she needed. When she returned to Forster Creations, the building felt different. Not physically, emotionally. Like walking into a space where the air itself had been conditioned by unresolved conflict. RJ met her near the elevators. You found something, he said immediately. Electra nodded once. Not everything, she corrected, but enough to challenge her. RJ exhaled slowly. That's going to escalate things, he warned. Electra didn't deny it. I know, but escalation was no longer avoidable. It was already happening. Inside Will's office, Ivy was gone for the moment. But Will was not alone. He was holding the results of an independent preliminary review he had quietly requested earlier that day. Not full confirmation, not final verification, but enough to introduce doubt into what had been presented as certainty. And doubt, once introduced, did not remain contained. It spread. It corrupted clarity. It redefined truth as something negotiable. Will sat down slowly, staring at the report. And for the first time since Ivy had entered his life again, he did not think about responsibility. He thought about possibility. Possibility that he was being manipulated. Possibility that he was being trapped. Possibility that everything he was about to sacrifice his life for might not exist at all. That evening, Electra confronted Ivy directly. Not in Will's office, not in public, but in the quieter corridor near the design floor, where voices rarely carried far enough to be overheard. Ivy turned when she saw her, almost expectant. I know what you did, Electra said immediately. Ivy did not react with shock, only calm curiosity. Do you? She asked. Electra stepped closer. The clinic records don't match, she said. There are inconsistencies, adjustments. Someone altered documentation. For a fraction of a second, something sharp passed through Ivy's expression, but it vanished almost immediately. And then she smiled, softly, almost pitying. You're grasping at shadows, she said. Electra's voice dropped. No, she replied. I'm pulling at threads. That distinction mattered, because shadows disappear when confronted. Threads unravel. Ivy tilted her head slightly. And what do you think happens when you pull hard enough? She asked. Electra didn't hesitate. The truth comes out. A quiet pause. Then Ivy stepped closer. And what if the truth doesn't look like what you want it to? She asked softly. That question landed differently. Not as denial, but as psychological pressure. Because it reframed the entire conflict. Not as truth versus lie, but as interpretation versus belief. Electra held her ground. I'm not afraid of truth, she said. Ivy studied her for a long moment. Then, almost gently, you should be. Later that night, Will requested a full medical verification. Not through Forster channels. Not through Ivy, but independently. The request itself was enough to change everything. Because once verification began, control no longer belonged to the storyteller. It belonged to evidence. And Ivy understood, finally, that the structure she had built was no longer stable. It was under examination. Electra stood alone afterward in the design studio, staring out at the city lights. RJ joined her silently. "She's cornered," he said. Electra did not respond immediately, because she was not thinking about victory. She was thinking about Will, about what he would become when truth finally arrived, whether it would free him or destroy him. And somewhere in that uncertainty, Electra understood something uncomfortable. This was no longer just a battle between two women. It was a collapse in progress. And when it finished unfolding, nothing had forced her creation.